Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. A couple years ago, I was very fortunate to meet John Tomasi, and I said, he's a political philosopher, and I said, John, give me one book to read that you would recommend everyone read. And he goes, Keith, you got to read this book called Why Not Capitalism by Jason Brennan. Today, I am fortunate enough to have Jason Brennan with us. Jason, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Jason, why do you believe capitalism is morally superior to socialism?
Well, what I say in that book is you have to basically make a choice. Are you trying to talk about which system is the best for real human beings in the real world with all of their flaws? Or are you engaging in a question of like, what would a perfect utopian society made up of angels look like? And the reason a lot of people advocate socialism is because they don't answer those questions consistently. They make confused sorts of answers. So basically, in the real world, realistic capitalism beats realistic socialism. It's not to say capitalism doesn't have its flaws, but if you compare countries that are capitalistic to countries that are socialist, what you find is that people are happy, healthier, wealthier. The poor do better in capitalist countries than they do in socialist countries, etc. And so the flaws are just much worse in the socialist countries. But then a lot of people, they recognize that. Like, for example, the great philosopher Jerry Cohen, who's a major Marxist philosopher, admits that basically capitalist countries are outperforming the socialist countries. But he says, aha, but if only we were angels, we would make socialism work, and socialism would be better than capitalism. But what he ends up doing in his book called Why Not Socialism is comparing an ideal conception of socialism to what he takes to be a realistic description of capitalism. So he's basically saying socialism with angels would be better than capitalism with real people. He might be right about that, but what he really needed to do, and he never does, is to ask, what would capitalism with angels look like? Would that be as good or better or worse than socialism with sort of morally perfect people? So I think when you try to do a like-to-like comparison, when you try to imagine how would capitalism go if people were morally flawless, you see that actually that would be better than socialism too. So ideal capitalism beats ideal socialism. Realistic capitalism beats realistic socialism. Ergo, capitalism is better than socialism.
On page 50 of your book, you use Gwyneth Paltrow to discuss inequalities, and you claim that people do much better than others on morally arbitrary grounds is the argument from people like Jerry Cohen and John Rawls specifically. How do you address the concern that capitalism exacerbates inequality, inequality is immoral, therefore capitalism's immoral?
Yeah, so one question is, does justice actually require equality in the first place? I often think that egalitarians are what I call leftists who suck at leftism. What I mean by that is they have a moral concern and they're misidentifying what the problem is. The problem, I think, is some people are poor, some people don't have enough, and sometimes this isn't their fault. There's a problem with the system being designed. Designed is not the right word, but the system is set up in such a way, perhaps through historical circumstance, to deprive certain people of real opportunity, and so their lives don't go well. And we can complain about those things, but complaining about poverty and a lack of opportunity is not quite the same thing as complaining about equality. So I think like the problem when you look around the world is that some people don't have enough. The problem isn't that they have less than others; it's that they don't have enough. So that said, sometimes people think egalitarianism is really about the lionization of envy. It's about looking at differences between people. And the Rawlsian kind of idea, and the thing that, the reason I use the Gwyneth Paltrow example is they think, well, she might have gotten all these roles in movies because she's physically attractive, but to a certain degree, her degree of physical attractiveness is not a result of her choices. It's a result of having good genes. I make a lot of money. I have a high status, good job. And the reason I have that is because I have a high IQ. But, it's not like it's my fault I have a high IQ. It's not like before I was born, I was in pre-embodiment heaven and I took a merit test and they decided to give me like a good IQ. It's rather just luck of the draw. So many people who have a kind of egalitarian intuitions make the following argument. How well you do in life depends largely upon factors that are outside your control, your social circumstances that you're born into, the kinds of parents you have, and the kinds of genes you have. You don't deserve those things. You didn't earn them. So therefore, anything you earn on the basis of those factors cannot really be deserved either.
In your book, Political Philosophy and Introduction, and in your book, Why Not Capitalism, you mentioned this excellent book, The Problem of Political Authority, an examination of the right to coerce and the duty to obey by Michael Huemer. Well, what is so important about this book?
Yeah, that is one of my favorite books. So one of the main questions in political philosophy is what, if anything, justifies government? And in particular, governments claim to have two special moral powers, which I'm going to use different words than the ones he uses. I call them legitimacy and authority. Legitimacy refers to a supposed governmental power to create and enforce rules within over a certain geographic area against certain people. So governments are a proper subset of a society which claim the right to have monopoly power in coercively enforcing rules. That's what they are. So what makes government legitimate, if anything? Why would it have the right to create these rules? Why would it be allowed to enforce rules that others cannot? Authority is another purported power of government, where to have authority is to have something like a power to impose on others an obligation to obey. So if I say to you right now, you may not smoke marijuana, you don't think you have any obligation to follow my orders, right? I'm like, I order you not to smoke pot. You're like, who are you? I don't have to listen to you. But when governments order us not to smoke pot, most people believe that we acquire an obligation not to do it in virtue of government issuing that order. So it's really perplexing. Why would government have legitimacy? Why would it have authority? And what Mike does in that book is very carefully goes through a couple thousand years of arguments trying to show that governments have authority and legitimacy. And it's amazing how bad these arguments are. It's like basically they all fail. So the argument that you get in in middle school that your teachers tell you is, well, government has authority because you consent to government. And it's like, no, you don't. There's no plausible interpretation of the relationship between you and your government under which it's consent. They'll make other kinds of arguments as well. So Mike very carefully goes through and shows that none of these arguments work. He then gives us a psychological diagnosis about why we might believe in government authority, even though we don't have any good arguments on its behalf. And that's the first half. The first half just basically shows we don't have any reason to believe in authority or legitimacy. The second half then asks, is anarchism feasible? So if we don't have reason to believe in authority or legitimacy, what about the alternative, anarchism? And Mike says, look, we don't know if it would work. Maybe it would be a disaster, but he gives us some grounds for thinking empirically that it would work better than people think. A lot of the things they think would happen under anarchy, it's not as bad as they think. And some other books you might read on that, if you're interested in anarchism, there's a book called Anarchy Unbound, which is a nice kind of case study in how anarchism is actually, I think the subtitle is Why Anarchism Works Better Than You Think. And another book by Edward Stringham called Private Governance, where he points out that, as a matter of fact, this is an empirical claim, most of the government or governance, the rule enforcing that protects your rights in your own life, is not done by government. It's done through extra legal channels.
I had the pleasure of meeting Edward Stringham at the Freedom Summit a couple months ago with David Friedman, and he gave a terrific speech on private governance. It's amazing to me, just going through Michael Huemer's book, that the people who claim to support equality believe that like 535 congressmen have the right to rule coercively 330 million Americans. And Michael just lays those arguments out so well in that great book. Do you believe the state has the right to monopolize any weaponry like AR-15s?
Yeah, gun control, I know this is like the big issue right now and everyone's so into it. And it's one of those things where I don't have strong opinions either way about the empirics or even about the moral issues. So I think it's very plausible that you have a right to you have a right to self-defense. I think everyone accepts that. And then it's plausible to claim that perhaps your right to self-defense gives you some right to own certain kinds of weapons to protect yourself. On the other hand, there's also this issue in that arming people can impose externalities upon others because there's a certain level of risk when you have general levels of armament. And so there's a question of exactly what kinds of weapons you should be allowed to have. Some people claim you should have a right to not only to overthrow your government, but I think that's kind of covered by the issue of just war theory. And the problem with revolution is that it's incredibly risky. Normally, the normal effect of government revolution is to impose dictatorial people who abuse rights even more. It's pretty rare for revolutions to work out favorably for liberty. So I'm not quite sure that there's a right to revolution per se, which might bear on what kinds of weapons you can have. But when I look at the empirical work on do certain forms of gun control work, do others not work, it's it's a lot of, it seems to me, a lot of highly ambiguous stuff, often quite motivated. Like one side wants to prove its view is right, one side wants to prove the other view is right. I think it's just really kind of a mess. That said, a lot of the arguments that people make, and so I don't really have strong opinions either way. But one thing I noticed is a lot of the arguments that people make about gun control and about other things seem to apply to other issues that they wouldn't want to make the same kind of argument. So people will say, well, allowing you to own a weapon, just the general possession of weapons imposes a certain degree of risk upon other people. And you could say, yeah, well, so does having alcohol. Like, so why are we going to allow alcohol? Like, alcohol is even more dangerous than handguns. Why are we going to allow everyone to have alcohol? And their basic argument is like, some of them will say, well, I'm a civil libertarian, and I think it's within your rights, and if it imposes risks upon other people, then too bad. Others will say, well, we tried alcohol prohibition and it didn't really work. And then you have to wonder to those people, why do you think handgun prohibition would work? Why do you think AR-15 prohibition would work? I mean, it is true that Australia at one point confiscated a large number of weapons, and that did seem to work out pretty well. But we have a very different culture here in the United States. I suspect that if you try to do sort of a mass confiscation program, it's not going to work the way it did in Australia. You're going to have a lot of resistance to it. There's what's the ratio of weapons to people in the U.S.? It's roughly 1-to-1. So you have a massive preponderance of weapons. How are you going to get rid of all of those? So my main worry about a lot of gun control arguments is that just forget about the liberal libertarian argument for a second. Just think clearly about effectiveness. I'm not sure that most of their measures that they advocate would have any real effect. So yeah, if prohibiting it doesn't have an effect, what's the point? So yeah, if I could wave a magic wand and have it so like people were not as well armed, I'd consider that. But we don't have any such magic wand, so it's not even worth maybe talking about it.
In Michael Huemer's book, he goes into not only the atrocities of Mao, Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot, but he gets into the My Lai massacre.
Yeah.
Who do you think holds more moral culpability in such atrocities? The order giver, the politician, or the order follower, the soldier?
Yeah, that's a good question. Who has more is really hard. If you're making lots of these orders, you're probably causing mass damage. But then I do think the person who follows the orders has a high degree of moral culpability. In fact, I have a book coming out later this year called When All Else Fails. And the subtitle we haven't quite focused on or settled, but I think the subtitle is going to be The Ethics of Uncivil Disobedience, or perhaps the Ethics of Resistance to Government Injustice. And the thesis of the book is that you have the same right of self-defense against government agents as you have against me. So what I claim is that government agents do not, contrary to popular belief, enjoy what I call special immunity, which means whatever the conditions are that would determine when you're allowed to lie to me, fight back against me, resist me, hurt me, or kill me in self-defense or in defense of others, those very same conditions apply to government. There's no difference to that. Which means, if I'm right, that if you see something like a police officer choking Eric Garner to death and you're armed, it's morally permissible for you to shoot him and run away. Now, it would be deeply imprudent to do so because they'll probably send a SWAT team to murder you. But morally speaking, you're allowed to do that. It means that if a president is about to start an unjust war and you could somehow stop it by sniping him or hurting him or something like that, you'd be allowed to do it. It also means that government agents, the people who work for government, the soldiers and so on, have permission to resist the orders of their superiors and to fight back if necessary. So I don't think that there's, I'm just following orders is never an excuse. Unless there's like literally a gun to your head, like we are going to hurt you unless you hurt somebody else, you have to say no.
Holding the state to the same standards as everyone else. That's one of my favorite thought crimes. How can an atrocity like slavery exist from philosophers from Plato to John Locke? And is the draft morally on par with slavery?
Well, how can it exist? I mean, throughout history, you see lots of cultures practice slavery. Some practice worse forms of it than others. You can read a nice book called SPQR by, what's her name, Mary Beard, is that right? On Roman history. And she talks at great length about Roman slavery and how the form of slavery they practiced was probably a lot better than the form of slavery that was practiced in the United States in the early 1800s and in the colonies before that, because the Romans would give their slaves more rights, and they had a very high percentage of them who would eventually be manumitted. there is a question about to what degree government is reinforcing slavery. So you have, things like the Fugitive Slave Act and a number of other laws that like not only institutionalize slavery, but put in all these institutional protections of it. So there's a question of like, would this practice have disappeared earlier without some kind of level of government intervention? So slavery seems to be this fairly universal phenomenon. And honestly, the best thing I've ever heard said in favor of it was by, I think it was Judge Posner, where he said, back thousands of years ago, you often had situations where everyone was at war with everyone else. And slavery was the alternatives, given how unstable things were. The alternative was we either enslave your men or we kill them. We can't let them go. And in that situation, maybe it's given how horrible conditions are, maybe this was the best alternative. Though even Posner doesn't think that it applies to slavery in more recent times, like in the past 500 or 600 years. He says maybe a couple thousand years ago, that was something of a justification, or at least an excuse. Now, is the draft morally on par with slavery? It has certain slave-like features where we're demanding that you go and fight somebody. We're going to throw you in jail if you don't. On the other hand, it's not the same as owning chattel slavery in the 1800s. They can't sell you for profit. They can't do just anything they want with you. You still continue to have certain kinds of rights, such as a right to own property, a right to make certain kinds of financial decisions, certain rights of free speech, and so on. So I think it has certain slave-like features, and it is objectionable for those grounds, but it's an exaggeration to say it's literally on par with most forms of slavery throughout history.
I'll often ask people, if I don't like what Olive Garden's doing and I go there, can I stop working there or going there? Or what if I do the same with Walmart? And people look at me and say, obviously, of course you have the right to stop funding them. However, when it comes to government services, people don't extend that same courtesy. How is it that people have been tricked, or people understand government to be held to a total different moral standard than all other organizations?
Yeah, well, in general, I work a great length on political psychology, and a lot of my work is on thinking about what political psychology tells us about the justification of democracy and voting behavior. And in general, what political psychologists find is that most people don't really have an ideology. They don't really have strong political beliefs. And the people who do, for most of them, it's kind of a post hoc rationalization, where the model is almost like, this would be sort of personal to me. It's like, you're an Irish guy from northern Massachusetts. Irish guys from northern Massachusetts tend to vote Democrat, not because there's anything special about the Democrats helping them, but just because that's what people like us do. In the same way that like you root for the Patriots if you're from the Boston area, right? And then a small percentage of those people will then post hoc rationalize that they agree with the beliefs of their party. Mm. So I think when you look at what people believe about politics, you can't really get too excited by that. It's not the purpose of, as Robin Hanson would say, the purpose of politics is not policy. Politics is not about policy. People's political beliefs are not about describing how they think the world really works or should work. It's rather, we use our political beliefs in the same way that we use these t-shirts. It's a way of showing certain people that I'm on their side and I'm part of their coalition. So yeah, the fact that there's an inconsistency in most people's beliefs is not surprising, because they're not using those beliefs to form a rational theory about the world. They're using them for another social purpose. But you're right, there is a huge tension there, in that the reasons that people give against monopoly, against especially mandatory monopoly. Why would it be bad if Walmart were the only retailer and you would be forced to shop at Walmart? If there were no permission to have competition, they're going to give you some account for that. And if you ask them the same question, well, why doesn't your anti-monopoly argument apply to government? They're going to give you, it's not clear how they overcome that. The main thing that they're going to say, of course, is, well, we have to have a monopoly on violence. Violence is different. Governments enforce the rules with violence. And if we had competition, what that would mean is that we'd have warring factions on the street constantly fighting. Police force A and police force B would be shooting each other to try to maintain dominance. And so, is that true? Well, again, I think you would look at that book, Anarchy Unbound by Peter Leeson, and Mike Huemer's book, The Problem of Political Authority, to give you an account of why this view of anarchy is probably not right. That anarchism would not mean just constant violence on the streets between warring factions and gangs.
Why are some countries rich and other countries poor? And other countries poor. I'm specifically referring to your article regarding Louis C.K.'s Evil Life.
Yeah, so this is the thing where there's surprising consensus among economists. What I'm about to say is not particularly libertarian. This is just the standard economic view, the standard view in development economics. And keep in mind, the average economist and the modal economist is probably a moderate Democrat, like in the US. So the standard view, you can read this in Why Nations Fail by Darren Achimoglu and James Robinson. You can see this in a bunch of other things, is that countries are rich because of institutions and countries are poor because of institutions. Or maybe a better way to put it is poverty is the default natural state of human beings, and certain institutions guarantee that you'll remain in poverty, and certain institutions cause people to leave poverty. This is Adam Smith's thesis. This is what economists have been largely defending since. Which institutions? You can give a list. Having a stable form of governance characterized by the rule of law is incredibly important. Why? Because it allows people to plan long term and gives them an incentive to invest. If you're under a capricious rule, you have no incentive to think long term and no incentive to invest because you know that the rulers can mistreat you and take your stuff at any point. Having stable private property free of the threat of expropriation. That's incredibly important. The countries that have that are rich. The countries that lack it are poor. Having open markets and free trade, but that's important. So stable governance, private property, strongly protected private property, and open markets. Those are the things that lead to prosperity. Basically every country that has those three things is rich. Every country that lacks them is poor. When countries move to having more of these institutions, they become richer. When they start moving away from those institutions, they become poor. That's the standard view in development economics. The thing that a lot of people are taught in high school by historians, and unfortunately historians are generally not social scientists, they're just humanities professors who don't do rigorous data. The view that you're taught often in school is that, well, some countries are rich and others are poor because of past colonial expropriation. And it's true that the Western European countries engaged in a lot of colonialism, but whether that made them rich is an empirical question. And actually, if you haven't read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, it's worth noting that The Wealth of Nations was on this very point. It was an anti-imperialist book. And Smith's argument in that book was, if you look at the value of the raw materials that England gets from its empire, and you compare that to the expenditure, the expenses it has to get those raw materials, the tax expenses, the military intervention, what you find is that you're spending more to get those raw materials than the value of the raw materials themselves. Be like the kind of thing where, imagine I try to mug you and I rob you of $50, but in order to rob you of $50, I had to buy a $500 handgun. Well, I lose. I'm actually losing money. And so Smith says, if you carefully calculate this out, what you find is empires are losing money. And in fact, he's right about that. We have more data than he does. There's this nice book from the 80s called Mammon and Empire, which calculates this out. And they're like, yep, Smith's right. Empires lose money. So why does it happen? It's a story of concentrated benefits and diffuse cost. A small number of politically well-connected people, the East India Company, certain arms manufacturers, the king himself, they benefit from empire. And the cost of empire are diffused among the masses who have to pay for the taxes. They get some raw materials, but the raw materials they get back are less valuable than the taxes they paid to get them. So imperialism is not the explanation for why some countries are rich and others are poor. It's not because of resources. In general, countries with good resources tend to be pretty poor and have bad governance, and countries with good resources or bad resources tend to be richer. Economists actually call this the resource curse. You can Google that. Norway might be the one exception to this. And the thought is that if you have stable, lots and lots of resources, what tends to happen is politically powerful people will create a bad governance system that allows them to extract the value of those resources. And so you will not have the protection of private property. You won't have a government characterized by the rule of law. In contrast, the countries that have bad resources tend to have to develop sort of by necessity good institutions, and then their ones become rich. So Adam Smith noticed this too. He's like, the Netherlands and England are rich, and France and Spain are relatively poor. Why is that? France and Spain have way better resources than the Netherlands. Netherlands is underwater, and England doesn't have that much stuff either. During the Cold War, you can see this. The United States has worse resources than the USSR, but it's much richer. Hong Kong is much richer than mainland China per capita, even though mainland China has awesome resources and Hong Kong is a bunch of rocks. Singapore is rich compared to, say, the areas around it, but it's not because it has more resources. South Korea is richer than North Korea, even though North Korea has slightly better resources. In general, resources don't explain it. It's institutions. Do you have stable governance characterized by the rule of law, open markets, and the robust protection of private property?
Well, don't count your chickens before they hatch on the USSR prediction. Economist Paul Samuelson has assured us by 1990 the USSR will surpass the United States.
Yep, and he was wrong about that. Yeah, even the numbers in the 50s about GDP per capita, a lot of that was just an artifact of the way that we count GDP. If the government spends $1 trillion digging holes in the ground and filling them back in, that shows up as $1 trillion of GDP expenditure, but it doesn't mean anyone's actually wealthier. Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is we actually look at like consumption activity within the USSR over its history. You find that there is basically stagnant, that people's lives do not get much better. And in particular, it's really bad for the poor. And by the way, that reminds me of something I forgot to say in response to one of your questions. You said people claim that capitalism causes inequality. It's not really clear it does. If you run like a regression right now and you take like the Fraser Institute's ranking of how capitalistic countries are, and then you look at their Gini coefficient and you run a regression, you don't really get much of a relationship there. You don't get much of a positive relationship. Even if you do it like looking at their pre-tax and transfer income, you don't get much. There is a view that says that as countries tend to develop, they become more unequal, and then they reach a certain point and they start to become more equal afterwards. Though it's not clear that has to do with the capitalism per se. So this claim that capitalism leads to inequality, it's surprisingly weak. The literature, the empirical evidence for that is surprisingly weak. And the people who are making that argument are usually relying upon armchair arguments rather than like actually running data-based regressions.
Jason, I just got 3 more questions for you. I often ask people, like, how do you fix a car or fly a plane or build a house? And they'll look at me and say, like, I've never studied those things. I have no clue. That's not my area of expertise. But then I'll ask them about politics. And when they've done an equally zero amount of research on anything, they'll have very strong opinions about world wars, the war on terror, economics, philosophy, morality, history, what's going on today. Why do people see politics as something that they need to have an opinion on, and they can't just say, you know what, that's not my area. I'm going to let the Jason Brennans of the world deal with that?
Yeah. So, going back to like the 1960s, there's a very famous political scientist named Philip Converse, and he argued that most voters are not very ideological. They don't actually have something like a consistent set of political beliefs or even a stable set of political beliefs. When you poll most people and ask them their opinion about something in politics, they don't like to say, I don't know. So they'll give you an opinion. If you ask them that same question like a week later, they'll give you a different opinion. And they won't even know that they've changed their mind because it wasn't a stable opinion. So roughly about half of, I call them hobbits in one of my books, roughly about half of voters in the United States don't really have something like a stable ideology. But the other half do. And they're often, even though they're often really badly informed, they don't know anything about history. They don't know, they haven't like read any of the social science, but they have really strong opinions. So, I have a family member that has very strong opinions, say, about campaign finance. And I ask her, well, there's this big literature on this in political science. Are you familiar with any of it? And she's like, nope, but she still has strong opinions, right? Doesn't matter. And I tell her, well, it turns out that, keep in mind, this research is being done by moderate Democrats, and they're on your side politically, but they think you're wrong about this. And she's like, well, studies can lie. They're probably just hacks. They're probably Republican hacks secretly. That's what she said. Why do we have such strong opinions? Well, again, I think it's because for most people, politics is not about policy. It's not that you form political beliefs because you're trying to advance your interests through voting. That's not what people are doing. Rather, you form political beliefs because it's useful for you to be a member of certain coalitions, to express that you're on a team, right? So by wearing this Patriot shirt around, like not around here in Tucson, but by wearing this around the Boston area, people go, you're one of us. I can trust you. Maybe I'm more interested in dating you. Maybe I'm more interested in going into business with you. I can see that you're one of us. And there's a thought that even like religion plays this role. It's a signaling to other people that you're one of us and we can trust you. But this team mentality that you're one of us requires that there be an opposing team. So that means like you can't just be pro Red Sox, you have to be anti-Yankees. And so politics serves this function. It's like, I'm one of you, mate with me, have children with me, do business with me, invest in me, admit me to your other clubs, make deals with me. And to prove I'm really one of you, I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to adopt expensive beliefs. I'm going to believe a bunch of bullshit I have no evidence for and sincerely believe it, which proves I'm really, really one of you. And also, I'm going to hate those people over there because that's what we do. So the fact that I'm constantly signaling my hatred for them proves I really am one of you. That's what's going on with politics. So the strength of the belief makes sense. It's instrumentally rational for people to behave this way given their goal. But their goal is not to change policy for the better. Their goal is to prove that they're a member of a team in order to get deals and things for themselves.
Both you and Michael Hume and Robert Nozick say that the work of John Rawls is so important, it's so big, it's so widely accepted that I believe Nozick said that the starting point is Rawls is correct, now disprove him.
Yeah.
Why was Rawls so big? What did Nozick oppose about his arguments, and what are some flaws in the Rawlsian theory of justice?
Oh, I mean, we could spend 16 hours on that question, but I'll give you maybe a couple-minute answer. The Rawlsians tell a story where they say political philosophy was was terrible, and then Rawls came along and revitalized it. I don't think that's true. I think there was good political philosophy being done before Rawls. Rawls did a couple things. One is he had like a really big systematic vision and systematic theory that had a lot of detail to it. And regardless whether you agree with it, there's a lot of beauty to the theory and a lot of beauty to some of the basic arguments. And philosophers love big theories. It's interesting to work on Kant, even though a lot of his stuff is kind of crazy. It's still interesting. He also, set out to very actively. This is not me making fun of him. This is his own self-description of what he's doing. He set out to try to systematize what you might call 1968 liberalism. What does a moderate Democrat in 1968 think? How do you fit all of these ideas together into a coherent ideology, and not just into an ideology where you put out the details, but you have some sort of explanation of why that ideology might be true? And he gave us a theory like that. He also, used a contractarian thought experiment, and for whatever reason, philosophers just really love contractarian thought experiments. I don't know why, but they do. So, he gave a systematic justification for the kinds of stuff that everyone already believed, and then for that reason, he became really big. And it's even though I think every piece of it has some flaws in it, there's also a lot of stuff where you're yeah, there's something to be said for that. His basic move is we disagree about what justice is, but if we could just imagine people in a kind of bargaining position where it's fair and equal, and they're bargaining in a way that they can't sort of bias the rules for their own favor, but they have to make the rules that are best for everyone, what would they come up with? There's something to that kind of thought experiment that seems like that's a plausible way to settle accounts of what justice is. So that said, once he comes up with this basic framework, but then there's questions about the application of the theory. So for example, his theory has two basic parts, two principles. And the first principle is what we call the liberty principle. It says that everyone is entitled to an equal, adequate sphere of basic liberty compatible with like liberty for all. And then you ask him, great, so what counts as liberty here? Which liberties get protected? And in his book in 1972, he just gives us a list. And he doesn't really have much of a justification for why certain things go on the list. He doesn't have much of a justification for why certain things aren't on that list. It's not really until about 20 years later, in 1996, so really 24 years later, or I guess it was 1994, we get a book that tries to come up with a justification for why some things are on the list and others aren't. But the discussion there is pretty protracted. It doesn't really work. And so you get all this infighting among Rawlsians and others about, well, which liberties get protected and why? And that's just one particular issue. And there's almost any detail of Rawls you can point to and go, I'm not so sure why you think your theory has this implication.
You mention in response to a large number of people saying Donald Trump is the worst president ever, often referred to as Trump derangement syndrome. You talk about how something like Madeleine Albright's justification of 500,000 dead Iraqi civilians after the Gulf War, something like 200,000 dead Filipinos during the American-Philippine War. How were such state atrocities able to go on without people getting totally upset and them having some Nuremberg trials in America?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, again, part of this thing where Trump is the worst person ever, the reason people say that is not because they genuinely believe it. If they thought about it, they wouldn't really think that. It's because we get this sort of moral ramping up behavior. So let's say like I have an incentive to prove to you that I'm like really virtuous so that I have like higher status. So that might mean something like you point out a flaw and you go, well, that's the thing that's going on here. It's sexist. And I'm like, it's not only sexist, it's racist and classist. And you're like, you're right. Not only is it racist and classist and sexist, but it's like the worst thing ever. It's like you're trying to prove to others that you might call it like a moral princess. You know the story, The Princess and the Pea? So this is, I'm not being, this is just how the story goes. It's like this prince wants to find the true princess, and a true princess is someone who's so sensitive that she can feel a pea under 40 layers of mattress. Like that's how sensitive she is. We do this kind of moral thing where it's like, I'm so sensitive to morality that I can detect even the slightest error. And I can note that it's like really, really bad. Like you think it's only kind of bad. Well, I think it's super duper bad, which means if I think that, I must be morally better than you. So I must have higher status, and you should defer to me and like me and give me props and think highly of me. So I think we're engaged in this kind of moral game where we self-aggrandize and become self-righteous for the purpose of elevating our status. Most use of moral language in political discourse is bullshit, right? So when you see a person making a moral argument, you should interpret them as self-aggrandizing. It's rare for them to be sincere. So that said, like, why do people ignore all this other stuff? I mean, they're ignorant of it. They have no idea that it happened. It's not very interesting to them. We're tribalistic, so American atrocities aren't as bad as other atrocities, unless you're one of the people who, for your group, is important to be anti-American, in which case atrocities done by others don't matter, but American atrocities do matter. It's like the kind of thing where you ask people, okay, so you've heard of the Holocaust. Have you heard of the Holodomor? And they're like, no, what's that? It's like, oh, that's when Stalin starved all of Ukraine. Killed more people than the Holocaust. Like, I haven't heard of that. And it's true, they just haven't been taught it. So I think there's a combination of all these things going on. Rational ignorance plus the fact that people's political beliefs are not for describing the world, they're for forming coalitions. And the result that you get at the end is just this moral inconsistency that's quite repugnant.
Well, that picture of Winston Churchill, FDR, and Stalin would look a lot worse if people knew about the Holodomor atrocities. Finally, what's the most important thing you learned from David Hume? If you could ask him one question, what would you ask him?
Oh man, asking him one question. Let's see. I think what I learned from David Hume is that maybe this is a good way of putting it. I have a couple of friends and I are considering writing a book defending conservative philosophy, even though we're not conservatives. I mean, there's no interesting sense in which I'm conservative. I'm radically pro-immigration, and I just have a book coming out like defending open borders, another book coming out defending like shooting back at cops. So I'm not a conservative, right? But there's something to this thought. And so when we're thinking about writing this book, because we think it'd be useful for philosophers to grapple with these ideas, they're defended in a sophisticated way. And perhaps the basic thought here is that Rawls begins a theory of justice by saying justice is the first virtue of social institutions. Justice is the first virtue of institutions. It wins against efficiency, stability, and other kinds of concerns. And I think David Hume's argument, in effect, is, nah, it's not the first virtue. It's maybe like virtue number 7 on the list. Things like stability, peace, cooperate, just getting people to cooperate and live together peacefully without violence. That's way more important than justice per se. Justice is like a luxury good. That's kind of what I think is one of the lessons you can get from Hume. It's, I think, important, and philosophers have often forgotten or ignore. And if I could ask him anything, maybe I'd ask him if that's a good interpretation of his work.
Excellent. I just want to finish by thanking you for writing the book, Markets Without Limits. You talk about how about 100,000 people in America, 100,000 people are on the kidney wait list. Most of them will die. In Iran, selling kidneys is legal, and there is a list of surplus donors available. I think this is such an important topic. According to the stats I have, I'll post below, 13 people a day die from kidney failure. That is like a Parkland shooting every single day that can be avoidable if we believe in markets without limits. Jason Brennan, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Have a good one.
Take care.